I will be handing over right now to Julita Clancy, who's going to lead our next session. She is archivist who has done the great service of gathering the Dearman Fawcett papers together, which is a great boon to everybody interested in this period. And she's also one of the driving forces behind the Families Group, that's helped brought this conference together. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Julita Clancy.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks also to UCC for this wonderful conference and this opportunity. Now, our next presentation is on Ulster and the Treaty, Ireland's Other Civil War, it's entitled, and the speaker is Dr. Robert Lynch, who's presently in Glasgow, a university in Scotland. He has taught and researched at various universities across Britain and Ireland, including Stirling, Oxford, Trinity College Dublin, Warwick, and Queen's University Belfast. His research interests are in the history of Ulster in the 20th century, with particular focus on partition and the establishment of Northern Ireland. He has published numerous articles on these subjects in scholarly journals and contributed to edited volumes, including the recent anthology, Atlas of the Irish Revolution. His books include a study of Irish republicans in Ulster, the Northern IRA in the early years of partition, 1920-22, which came out in 2006, and the Partition of Ireland, 1912 to 1925, which was published by Cambridge in 2019. He currently lives and works in Glasgow, and he'll speak today, as I said, on Ulster and the Treaty.
Okay, so I think the first thing to say is the Anglo-Irish Treaty has perhaps the dubious distinction of causing not one but two civil wars in Ireland. In 1922, of course, both of these new Irish states face very similar problems in the shape of recalcitrant and aggressive political and religious minorities. And both, of course, will establish their hegemony by heading down the dark path of political authoritarianism. So the suspension of civil liberties, internment, executions, etc., etc. Now, the Southern Civil War, which begins in late June 1922, would be preceded by a similar conflict in the other partition state of Northern Ireland. Between January and June, Ulster experienced violence on an unprecedented scale, a period really equivalent to the worst years of the Troubles in the 1970s, certainly far more concentrated. You have an intensely destructive IRA campaign of kidnapping, assassination, and arson, which inspires frenzied reprisal rioting and sectarian expulsions in Belfast, with over 200 people losing their lives in the city. Thousands more are injured, left unemployed, or become homeless refugees forced to seek sanctuary in Dublin, Glasgow, or Manchester. Indeed, I think so drastic was the violence in Ulster in the months following the treaty that I think if you'd actually asked anyone in March 1922 where they thought civil war would break out in Ireland, they would probably have said in the north. Now, the Anglo-Irish Treaty can be held responsible for causing a great deal of this instability. Like the Government of Ireland Act, the treaty's claim to provide an all-Ireland settlement was little more than gesture politics. It was a separate settlement for the South and West, with only token idealistic allusions to Irish unity. So while Northern Ireland was technically included in the treaty, it was given the right to opt out of the agreement, which is a right, of course, that Craig would exercise at the earliest opportunity, travelling to London personally on the 7th of December 1922 to deliver his Parliament's decision made just that afternoon. And of course, there'd been no need to hurry. By the terms of Article 14 of the treaty, the Northern Parliament had a month to make its choice, but Craig was anxious, in his own words, not to show the slightest hesitation to the world of his government's rejection of the whole nationalist project. As one of his MPs observed in the brief debate a few hours earlier, Ulster's decision was akin to that of a lifeboat readying itself to escape a sinking ship. So it had long been clear that the British were following a two-state, two-treaty answer to the Irish question. And establishing a functioning Northern Irish government was the first priority. I'll show you a little picture here from the opening, the great day when the Parliament opens, the King's visit. And it's only after the elections to the new Northern Irish Parliament in May 1921, and a new government is in place in Belfast, that they then move to bring the War of Independence to a halt with the truce in July, and then move on to appease Southern nationalists. Even so, despite all that, the issue of partition could not be ignored in the treaty, especially when it came to the vexed issue of the border. And the answer, of course, which is going to emerge to address these territorial disputes between the two new states, would be through the use of the flawed mechanism of a boundary commission. Now, less a final solution than a way of once again sidestepping the partition problem, the boundary commission idea was presented to Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith at a meeting on the 8th of November. Now, while the reaction of the Sinn Féin delegation is qualified, they give just enough assent to the principle of a future amendment of the border to allow negotiations to move forward. And many, such as Arthur Griffith himself, seize on the solution as a way of assuring, in his words, we would save Tyrone and Fermanagh, part of Derry, Armagh and Down. And I'll give you an example of a map of, as it were, propaganda comes out of the south, kind of areas we're talking about that are going to be transferred. Of course, tellingly, there are no concrete declarations from the participants that such large-scale transfers are going to actually be involved. And Lloyd George himself, of course, is happy to allow the Sinn Féin leadership to place their faith in this vague scheme, as long as the partition issue no longer stops the negotiations from proceeding. Article 12 itself, and here is Article 12, states that at an unspecified time in the future, a commission comprising one representative from each of the Irish states and an independent chairman is to meet, as you can see there in that infamous phrase, to determine in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants, so far as may be compatible with economic and geographic conditions, the boundaries between the two new states. Now, the dangerous ambiguity of such an instruction, its lack of a definite timetable or any explanation of how the wishes of the inhabitants are to be determined, makes it almost the ideal document to cause even further violence and uncertainty in Ulster. And certainly when Feetham himself, the South African judge who's presented with this short paragraph, he has to now himself try and make head nor tail of this years later, after, of course, many of the participants in the treaty negotiations themselves have died. So what it does, creating this instability, on the one hand, the hopes of nationalists in majority Catholic areas are raised. And they're further encouraged, of course, by this promise in their ongoing resistance and obstruction to the Belfast regime. While, of course, by contrast, for Protestants, the threat of an unfavourable boundary adjustment adds to their sense of vulnerability and fear. And this is especially after the instigation of an IRA campaign along the frontier. James Craig, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, of course, leaves us a very memorable and perceptive analysis of the impact of the treaty on Ulster. As you can see, the Boundary Commission has been at the root of all evil. If you picture loyalists on the border being asked by us to hang on with their teeth for the safety of the province, you can also picture their unspoken cry to us, if we sacrifice our lives and our property for the sake of the province, are you going to assent to a commission which may subsequently, by a stroke of the pen, take away the very area you now ask us to defend? It's a very perceptive idea, this sort of sword of Damocles which hangs over particularly loyalists on the border. Craig is particularly alarmed at the failure of a Conservative-dominated government to defend the interests of the new Northern Ireland. It was very apparent that the radical Tory support for Ulster Unionism, which had been so vocal, of course, a decade earlier, had now dissipated. So while prominent Conservatives had supported Craig's resistance to any all-Ireland settlement in the early months of the treaty negotiations, they would not support his steadfast refusal to accept modifications to the border. And the faltering nature of Conservative support for the Belfast government had much to do, of course, with Lloyd George's own very skillful handling of the Ulster issue in the wider context of the treaty settlement. He, of course, Lloyd George, had ensured that senior Conservatives would be party to the settlement by making them key members of the treaty negotiating team. And not only does this move ensure that leading Tories were tied to the agreement, but also that the coalition government Lloyd George heads would not break over the vexed issue of Ireland. Indeed, it is very notable. I mean, if you look back and consider events in Ireland during the Ulster crisis, 1912 to 14, just how few Conservatives are prepared to ally with Craig in 1922. What you tend to get is only sort of cranks and outsiders, people such as Sir Henry Wilson, later, of course, to become a military advisor to the Northern government, who really invoke that old Tory radicalism of the pre-war years. Now, this sort of complex political manoeuvring from Lloyd George, certainly whilst it ends the poisonous influence of the Irish question on British politics, proves disastrous for Ireland itself. The response, of course, of Craig and the Northern Ireland cabinet in the face of all this political wrangling was to resist all compromise for the rest of 1922. Unionist attitudes to the British government were marked by increasing mistrust, and this again further stokes instability in the province. So while Lloyd George, of course, he warns that no agreement, he says, would be worth anything if all it did was to transfer the agony from the south to the north. This is exactly what the treaty is, of course, going to do in 1922. And all of this, what this leads to is all the most kind of extreme paranoias of the Unionist psyche are reinforced by events in Ireland after the signing of the treaty. You have a pernicious minority population within its own borders, supported by aggressive elements in the south, and an untrustworthy British government prepared to withdraw support at the earliest opportunity. So Unionist fears of the implications of the treaty and growing mistrust of the British government, especially, the RIC is being disbanded, of course, in the spring of 1922, would lead to a whole new focus on military solutions to the partition question. So the ad hoc special constabulary of 1920 would now be massively reinforced to defend the northern state against a feared onslaught from nationalist opponents on both sides of the border. By May 1922, there would be over 30,000 men under arms in Northern Ireland, costing, it was estimated, £5 per head for every citizen of the province. So just a vast sums of money involved. And the rest of the male Unionist population was also effectively mobilized as reservists in case of dire need. The existence, I suppose, ironically, of these new security forces would further increase tension between Belfast and London. I'd say their massive cost and their sectarian partiality. The specials right away are implicated in all manner of unsavory incidents and reprisal killings, along, of course, with their evident failure to stem the disorder in Northern Ireland, which is a fact demonstrated glaringly in June 1922 when British troops have to intervene. I'll show you here, secure the border at Beleek and Petticoat. So they had to put British troops on the ground now, again. And this leads many senior British politicians, including Churchill and Lloyd George, to conclude that the Belfast government was not functioning properly, and that maybe the whole basis of partition might need to be renegotiated. And here's a quick quote here, as you see from Lloyd George, writing to Churchill in May. "We have surely done everything that Ulster can possibly expect us to ensure security. 57,000 men ought to be equal to the protection of so small a territory. If they require more, they can get them. It is our own business as a great empire to be strictly impartial in our attitude towards all needs." So there you go. And of course, Stephen Tallants, himself, you can see on the right, is also sent over to investigate why the Northern government is not functioning. Now, when it comes to the Sinn Féin delegation, I suppose it may be fair to ask why they don't exploit these sort of growing divisions between London and Belfast. Now, of course, they aren't ignorant of the partition issue. In fact, they look to exploit its perceived injustices, threatening, of course, to use the issue as a pretext for abandoning the negotiations if necessary. And some people argue they politically outmaneuvered by the wily Lloyd George in accepting this ambiguous boundary commission. That's certainly one argument. But also, you have to argue that they're limited by their own nationalistic hubris and their profound misunderstanding, really, of the nature of unionist opposition. I mean, this is a very big theme, of course, and Claire O'Halloran wrote a wonderful book on this, if you get a chance to look at it. Throughout the negotiations, they stick rigidly to this long-rehearsed belief that unionist opposition was somehow inauthentic, unnatural, these are all quotes from the various participants, irrational, and that conflict in Ireland was due fundamentally to the British presence. In such a worldview, unionists are painted rather contradictorily as either aliens, these are all again quotes, foreigners, non-Irish, or on the other hand, courted as potential converts once they realize, in the words of one Sinn Féin activist, that they've been duped. So as De Valera says to Lloyd George in 1921, if your government stands aside, we can effect a complete reconciliation. But either way, what you get is unionist opposition was found to be somehow insincere and shallow. So as such, the Sinn Féin approach was informed by a rather unjustified suspicion that partition, rather than being an unwelcome and very crude compromise between two incompatible ideologies, was the result of some kind of British plot. And this is a perception, of course, which lingers in many quarters to this day. Now, this is rather ironic in many ways, because, of course, you can argue the treaty itself is a partitionist document. So with the treaty, the partition of Ireland has become an established fact, and the Sinn Féin delegation have agreed to that. Now, we might ask, why is that the case? Because, you know, no matter how generous any future boundary commission award to the South may have been, a Northern Ireland of some form would continue to exist. And you see this kind of denial, this kind of, and the lack of reference to the Ulster clauses during the passionate treaty debates, where they're throwing everything at one another, following in the Dáil. And then, of course, the unaltered presence of the boundary clause in De Valera's alternative to the treaty, document number 2, demonstrates very much that Southern nationalists are putting much greater priority on the extent of their own independence than they do on Irish unity. So despite all that transpires, De Valera is still able to say rather dogmatically, the difficulty is not the Ulster question. As far as we are concerned, this is a fight between Ireland and England. I want to eliminate the Ulster question out of it. So I think they have a sort of mistaken understanding of the authenticity of unionist opposition. Now, while many people are slipping into this kind of denial, or were able, like Griffiths, to persuade themselves of the value of the Boundary Commission, one person, of course, who appears to have very little faith in the idea is Michael Collins, and there he is there. In January 1922, of course, Collins even goes as far as to ditch the Boundary Commission completely when he has a meeting with James Craig, and he agrees with Craig that the two new Irish leaders would settle the border issue between themselves without any British involvement. This, of course, will be conveniently forgotten later on. Collins, it appears, has little belief that anything except coercion is going to shift the border. And in pursuit of that policy, he would rely instead on his typical conspiratorial methods, instigating a military and propaganda war against the new Northern government over the first 6 months of 1922. And Collins really does stand out amongst the leadership of Sinn Féin as someone who has come to accept the reality of partition and strove to do something about it. Now, the rationale behind Collins's Northern offensive policy remains rather hard to discern. Of course, there's little likelihood that sporadic border attacks and the shooting of Northern policemen would bring down the Unionist government, although in a sense it almost succeeds in spite of itself, as we've argued with this declining relationship between Belfast and London. If the aim is to somehow protect the Catholic minority, it proves itself to be deeply counterproductive, because any IRA attack along the border, no matter how small, once it hits the Belfast press, sparks off prolonged bouts of reprisal rioting, sectarian expulsions, and so on. However, the focus on the North, I think, also serves the purpose of appeasing hardline militarists in the South who declared against the treaty settlement. So I'll just show you a nice image here to show the joint IRA offensive policy you get. So viewed in this light, what you can say, maybe more cynically, is rather crudely put that the policy is a way of averting a civil war in the south by starting one in the north. The partition issue being, I suppose, the one subject on which there's broad substantive agreement. That's one particular argument. Now, of course, one group of Irish nationalists who were pinning their hopes on the south making a priority of the partition issue were the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland. And I think the chief legacy of the treaty for Ulster's Catholics was that Southern nationalists were now their acknowledged representatives. The Northern Catholic minority defer to the Dublin leadership due to a combination of practical political necessity and a positive faith in the assurances of unqualified support which they'd received. Now, this, of course, is a very risky strategy because any changes in the political resolve of the Dublin government is bound to impact on Northern minority aspirations. And of course, this is exactly what will happen in June 1922 with the outbreak of the Civil War in Dublin. Almost overnight, Southern support, all that money, all those men, all that propaganda and so on is withdrawn. And the Unionist government, which, as we've seen with Tallents's report and so on, is really a let off the hook now. And, they have time to consolidate their control now of Northern Ireland. And the Catholic minority is just rather abandoned then to its own fate. Of course, one thing about the treaty debates, of course, is that much like with the Ulster Unionists, which is Craig's complaint, is no one seeks input from the Catholic minority leaders when it comes to the issue of the North. They don't have a seat at the table. Making instead, of course, the huge assumption that the interests of Southern and Northern nationalists are identical. So as such, what you get is Northern nationalists have little recourse, but rather to look to the Southern leadership to advocate on their behalf. But it soon becomes very apparent that Northern minority opinion was far too complex to be dictated by a uniform nationalist strategy. I mean, just politically, there's Joe Devlin there. And there's a quote from Churchill, as you can see, talking about that maybe including Devlin would have been a better idea. The thrusting aside of Mr. Devlin has been one of the worst disasters in this situation. He was a better man than the present leaders in Southern Ireland and a tried parliamentarian who, if he had been given a chance, would have gone very far. So Joe Devlin and the remnants of the old Home Rule Party retain a strong power base in Belfast and East Ulster. And Sinn Féin has never, despite everything, has never managed to become the predominant political force amongst Northern Catholics. Collins himself, whilst receiving some support as a kind of minority spokesman, really gains his kind of patronage largely due to his senior role in the IRA, whose rather crude plans were increasingly defining nationalist policy in Ulster. So Southern initiatives such as the Belfast boycott, the abstention policy, the decision to pay the wages of Northern school teachers and so on, these receive only qualified support from the Catholic minority. And you can argue also when it comes to abstention from the Northern Irish Parliament and virtual exclusion from the Dáil, you'll note that Northern constituencies tend to be represented largely by Southerners. You notice Collins is the TD there for South Armagh. This is especially concerning, as it meant there was no forum really for Northerners to express their opinions within a kind of broader pan-nationalist framework, if you like. They tended to be reduced to an advisory role or making direct appeals to Collins and other members of the provisional government, many of whom were far less sympathetic to their plight. And this is especially the case after Collins himself is killed in August. They all talk about this attitude. You're not the same as what Collins told us. So now, while the promise or threat of the Boundary Commission raised tensions between Unionists and Nationalists in Ulster, it also spreads profound division within the Northern Catholic minority itself. So the thing is, those living on the border or in West Ulster who put their greatest faith in this scheme, believing, of course, they are soon to be transferred to the jurisdiction of the southern state. While, of course, for those in Protestant-dominated East Ulster, it's very clear, no matter how generous any boundary award is going to be, they are staying put. So you get this kind of division growing up now. So a nationalist Republican division, but also this geographic division as well. It's very clear that the treaty's northern clauses, I suppose like most aspects of the partition plan, were an ad hoc response to a rapidly changing situation on the ground. Once again, the British government had altered its policy to meet a short-term crisis, despite the oft-repeated claims that each new initiative offers a final answer to the partition problem. So both the treaty and the Government of Ireland Act only really make sense when treated as distinct political solutions for each of the two new states. In 1922, however, when efforts are now made to bring them, as it were, both together to form the basis of a broader settlement, it's abundantly clear that the two pieces of the partition jigsaw do not fit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lynch. I don't see any questions. There is a comment by John Sheehan about the Boundary Commission being in line with the Woodrow Wilson 14 points plan, but we're going to move on. We won't take the questions now. We're going to move on to Dr. Ian Dalton. And Dr. Ian Dalton is a graduate of UCC in Cambridge. He's currently a visiting research fellow in the Centre for Contemporary Irish History, Trinity College Dublin, and has been a visiting fellow at Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge. He was co-editor with Dr. Ida Mill of Protestant and Irish, the Minorities' Search for Place in Independent Ireland, which was brought out by Cork University Press in 2019. He is currently co-authoring the volume on Wicklow in the Four Courts County Histories of the Irish Revolution 1912 to 23, and he will speak to us today on Southern Irish Protestant minorities and the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And thank you very much, Dr. Dalton. It's over to you now.
Good afternoon. This has been an excellent conference, illuminating all sorts of corners that have hitherto, I think, been in shadow. My thanks, of course, for the invitation to speak here. It's a bit sobering to think that in 1971, when I was a student at UCC, I was as far away from the treaty then as this conference is now from my own student days. So Tempest has done quite a lot of fugiting since then. In January 1922, the Irish Times was fearful for the Southern Loyalists, as it now called them, now suddenly beached on the wrong side of a revolution. They, quote, "faced the future with anxious hearts," wrote the Times. "All their old landmarks have disappeared. They have reached a point where they must break with traditions that were very dear to them. They are forced to adjust their minds to an entirely new set of ideals and ideas." The truce and treaty ended an extremely disturbed and disturbing few years for the Loyalist minority, with many stories of murder, burnings, intimidation, and flight. While not all Loyalists were Protestants, most Protestants were Loyalist in varying degrees of enthusiasm. Militants may have perceived their actions as against Loyalists who supported the authorities or betrayed them, but many Protestant Loyalists thought that they were being targeted merely as Protestants. While no rerun of 1641 or Scullabogue, Church of Ireland Diocesan Synod reports captured that sense of unease and despair in 1920 and 1921. Depopulation was already obvious through reduced church and school attendance, although it would take until the 1926 census to reveal its true extent. It is difficult to adduce the reasons why Indigenous individuals and families left. Charles Townsend has written, "Protestants' own sense of persecution should not necessarily be taken at face value. Insecurity is more a psychological than a physical state." Southern Unionist historian R.B. McDowell summed it up, "Hardships sustained by the Southern Loyalists were on the whole not excessively severe nor long-lasting." The 400 or so Protestant homes and businesses burnt between 1919 and 23 were individual tragedies, but a modest tally for a revolution in which the minority was seen as at best neutral and at worst often actively hostile towards the majority aspirations. The aristocracy and gentry, few in numbers but still significant socially and economically, and indeed noisy, especially from the safety of Parliament in London, were particularly targeted. But only about 4% of big houses were actually destroyed between 1920 and 1923. Against that, there are many stories of kindnesses from Catholics who put in a good word to rescue Protestants, and several Protestant clerics maintained that interdenominational relationships on the whole remained cordial. However defined, Protestant, Loyalist, Anglo-Irish, the minority is often placed in an enduring trope of descendancy and grand tragedy. And for those who write in that mode, like J.C. Beckett or Patrick Buckland or Terence de Vere White, the treaty looms large, a defining point of departure, exemplified by the title of Buckland's final chapter in his book, Irish Unionism 1. He calls it The End, 1922. But if that worldview seemed to draw a line under the Loyalist community, for other writers it marked the potential for something else, something new. The Anglo-Irish Treaty might be said to have exhibited a rather long finish. Elizabeth Bowen, writing as late as 1963, suggested that, quote, with the treaty, a new hopeful phase has started. I believe in its promise. For R.B. McDowell, on the other hand, a self-confessed neo-ex-unionist, the treaty seemed to usher in a rather Zen-like sense of stasis, of equilibrium, of semi-assimilation, as he puts it. For a long time, there existed a veneer of all-Ireland loyalism in organisations such as the Irish Loyal and Patriotic Union, founded in 1885, later in 1891, becoming the Irish Unionist Alliance, and the Unionist clubs. But the truth was that, politically powerless in the face of democratisation and Irish nationalism, Southern Unionists relied on the orange card to stymie Home Rule for the whole island. It was a dangerous and unstable investment which ultimately did not pay off. Ulster Unionism found its own regional voice and political structures separate from Southern loyalism. Northern Unionism's jettisoning of 3 Ulster counties in 1920 was the final break with its Southern counterpart. Some astute Southern Unionists had been reading the runes long before then. Lord Middleton tried to fashion a compromise with the Irish Parliamentary Party's Home Rule objectives at the Irish Convention in 1917-18. Already, though, the Middletonites were arguing yesterday's solutions with yesterday's men. Sinn Féin was the coming force, and nothing eventually emerged. After the truce, the Irish Times asserted that the Southern Unionists would be, quote, a vital factor in the settlement negotiations. And at a high political level, they tried to influence the Lloyd George government. But they were fatally divided. Their political representatives had split over the 1920 Government of Ireland Act, with the Lord Middleton-led Anti-Partition League facing off against the more die-hard Irish Unionist Alliance. Buckland claimed that the APL and Middletonites played a, quote, significant role in shaping the 1920 Government of Ireland Act and in the treaty negotiations in the autumn of 1921. But I'm not sure that that conclusion can really be sustained. Lloyd George played the Southern Unionists like a violin in those years. They were an irrelevance to the British government, which by mid-1921 had lost anyway its Southern Unionist ideological supporters like Walter Long and Lord Lansdowne. Lots of sound and choleric fury emanated from Irish peers and fellow travellers in the Lords, but signifying very little. Are the Southern Unionists to be ignored? Wrote the Provost of Trinity in a letter to the London Times in October 1921. The answer was, more or less, yes. They might have thought that they still had some purchase, whether over Sinn Féin or the British government, but the inconvenient truth was that once the Ulster issue had been sort of settled, they became a complete cipher. It was not helped by an extraordinary level of incompetence. At critical junctures, they failed to press Lloyd George for the government and Arthur Griffith for Sinn Féin for specific binding commitments on such as the Irish Army, land purchase, double taxation, compensation, continuation of the grant for TCD, and protection for ecclesiastical property. They got a couple of scraps from the treaty table. In November 1921, Griffith gave a written assurance that they would benefit from a scheme to give them representation in the new parliament, especially in the upper house. Ultimately, it was Griffith's sensitivity towards keeping the minorities' money in the country more than Southern Unionist pressure that saw some protections written into the treaty, Article 16's guarantee of educational and religious rights, and Article 2's implied right of appeal to the Privy Council if the treaty were violated. Otherwise, though, all this high politicking resulted in rather thin gruel. McDowell succinctly summed up the Loyalists' reaction to the treaty, a mixture, he wrote, of relief, shocked surprise, pessimistic acquiescence, and the intention of making the best of a fait accompli. Relief was probably the predominant emotion. Church of Ireland Gazette wrote that, quote, the people of the south and west of Ireland want peace. They do not care two straws about a republic. That possibly smacked of wishful thinking, but it probably accurately reflected the views of much of the minority. At a treaty debate in Sligo Corporation on the 29th of December 1921, a unionist councillor stressed the importance of the peace that the treaty would bring. Bishop Godfrey Dave Ossory, in asking his clergy to offer prayers of thanksgiving, welcomed the treaty, not because it represented an ideal solution, but because it gave respite. But if relieved that peace had broken out, it brought with it, in Lord Mayo's phrase, a cold douche of reality. As the Church of Ireland Gazette editorialised in January 1922, unionism has in any practical guise ceased to exist in practical politics. We regret its passing unreservedly, but practical men must face facts. Likewise, the Irish Times prospectus for the ex-Southern ex-unionists, quote, they must be up and doing. It is their interest that the Free State shall be an administrative and economic success. Apart from the quality of their attachment to the empire and to imperial traditions, Southern Unionists will have the same broad policy in future as the constitutional nationalists. Broadly, the tone was, we're stuck with it, we'll stay, it's our home, they'd miss our money, industry, and civilizing influence. But there was a sense the treaty was only acceptable because it was better than what had gone before. The Reverend Dudley Fletcher probably spoke for more than himself when he opined that I am in favour of the treaty chiefly because of the tragic and ghastly failure of the old system, but I no means expect a new heaven and a new earth. However, many looked for some optimism amidst ruined hope. A writer in the Church of Ireland Gazette opined that the coming change, quote, will not be without distinct elements of gain. The emphasis will shift from internecine political warfare with various governments in England to grappling with the practical problems of state building and management. Historian and Trinity professor Alison Phillips saw in the treaty the best chance the country had of restoring peace and prosperity, because a Sinn Féin government would have the legitimacy and clout to impose law and order. After the treaty's ratification, Lord Mayo organised a meeting in Dublin of the Southern minorities elite, mainly ex-landed gentry. He looked for positives too. Quote, no matter what government might be in power in Ireland, England was their best customer, and they would always have to trade with their best customer. Irish peers in London were less forgiving. Lord Farnham described the treaty as a cowardly surrender and a shameful betrayal, and Lord Oranmore and Brown feared that he was now a colonial in Britain. The Irish Times was pleased with any evidence of stability. An editorial on the 21st of January welcomed the appointment of the Bank of Ireland as banker to the state. But the Church of Ireland's Gazette's call in late December 1921 for Southern Loyalists to be brought more generally into the provisional government on the grounds that A, they were patriotic, and B, it could do with their business and financial acumen, was not taken up. If it suited Sinn Féin to present the nascent Dominion as inclusive and tolerant, they were unlikely to offer anything other than symbolic gestures to the minority. At Mayo's meeting, expressions of cooperation and engagement with the new regime in varying degrees of enthusiasm were read. Following the signature of the treaty, public declarations of loyalty were now almost de rigueur, although the extent to which this was purely tactical rather than representing a Damascene conversion is open to very considerable doubt. Church of Ireland Archbishop Gregg of Dublin was publicly prepared to accept the regime change, quote, as a constitutionalist if it is imposed by lawful authority. But his daughter reported that privately he felt he had been banished from the Garden of Eden. Archbishop Darcy of Armagh advocated that church people should faithfully obey the laws of the jurisdiction in which they now lived. But his later autobiography revealed an unreconstructed unionist, in a sour phrase, just happy that Ulster had escaped, quote, the Free State set up by the so-called treaty and the subsequent act of the Imperial Parliament. The Irish Times was lukewarm. Quote, the Southern Loyalists accept the treaty because the country accepts it and invites their aid in making it a success. Presbyterians were a little more positive. Quote, with our democratic training, our members will be willing and ready to take their part in the promotion of the peace and of the prosperity of our native land. All in all, the Loyalists may have considered that a bargain had been struck. In return for an outward acceptance of the constitutional dispensation, they had expiated their former sins. The responsibility for Irish history was no longer theirs to bear. But what cloak of identity were they now to don? Back in 1898, an uber nationalist Catholic curate, in the course of a diatribe against the political minority, had claimed that, quote, they are not born from our race. The Irish Unionists have no country. By 1916, they were characterized as, quote, the illegitimate children of Hibernia and John Bull. In 1921, with the signing of the treaty, it seemed that many did not now know what they were, or indeed what others expected them to be. Echoing that curate, Major Somerset Saunderson of Cavan lamented, now I have no country. Mirroring Lord Ottermore and Brown, J.H. Bernard, the Provost of Trinity College, wrote to an English friend that, quote, I confess that I don't like to think of myself as a colonial. Between truce and treaty, Edward Gwynn of TCD wrote that, quote, this last year has made me feel for the first time that I am essentially English and not Irish, in spite of certain sympathies and antipathies. The terms of the treaty and the constitution which followed in themselves did not require the minority to immediately choose between competing allegiances. As Nora Robertson later put it, in respecting new loyalties, it had not seemed incumbent upon us to throw our old ones overboard. The Church of Ireland Gazette maintained that while Protestants were, quote, as good Irishmen as any, they will still be loyal Britons. As the Reverend Dudley Fletcher said in 1922, I am proud of my British blood and name. I allowed the same privilege to my Gaelic neighbour. We both want to be proud of being Irishmen. The Southern minority, a term incidentally that started to come into common currency in early 1922, was not a ripe fruit just waiting to fall into Kathleen Ní Houlihan's capacious apron. Its ethnicity was tenacious, and it was never mysteriously going to change overnight. And indeed, over succeeding decades, Southern Protestants became a species of inner diaspora, utilising the treaty and its aftermath to invent an imagined community for themselves within the bounds of the new polity, one which we might call the Protestant Free State. One way in which belonging to what was could be squared with what loyalists wanted to belong to. On the 8th of December 1921, the Irish Times laid out its pitch, headed Traditions and Interests, a quote from the letter of reinsurance published by Arthur Griffith as a result of discussions with Lloyd George. An editorial detailed the main issues that would exercise the minority for decades to come. It made a distinction between Southern Loyalists and Southern Unionists. Political unionism was dead and incapable of resurrection, but the settlement allowed loyalism, that is, a sense of cultural and royalist Britishness, to linger on. Over the Irish Free State, we are still to have our king, a Dublin Anglican cleric reassured his flock on the 11th of December 1921. In the Provosts of Trinity's phrase, the king's government in Ireland was not a political concept that Sir Stott Éireann particularly acknowledged, but for loyalists and ex-unionists, it legitimised flying the Union flag and singing God Save the King, representing a narrow bridge to British values. They were still part of the Game of Thrones, subject of His Majesty in this revived Kingdom of Ireland. Symbolising this, immediately after the treaty's ratification, the Irish Times' court and personal column carried on as if nothing had happened. It was important to show that the Viceregal Lodge was still functioning. So on the 11th of January 1922, it reported that Lord and Lady Fitzallen of Derwent attended a lecture in the RDS and that Lady Fitzallen was at a performance at the Abbey Theatre that evening. And so on, right up to 1942, when the column finally disappeared as a consequence of wartime censorship. Secondly, the treaty settlement offered the prospect of a new and different engagement with Ireland. The Church of Ireland Gazette saw opportunities in the moral and spiritual sphere. Quote, the function of the church with regard to government in any country should be so as to permeate the life and thought of the people with the ideals of the kingdom of God. It can be the task of the Church of Ireland to work for this ideal in the future. It seems as if our church can worthily take a new position of spiritual leadership in the new Ireland. In the secular sphere, Andrew Jemison was optimistic that business could now have a more immediate influence on government. Hitherto, it had been a story of pointless deputations to an uninterested London. Thirdly, the wider citizenship of Britain and the Commonwealth that Sinn Féin had acquiesced in, quote, to come within the empire, as one Irish Times correspondent put it on the 10th of December 1921, was probably the most significant effect of the treaty as far as the southern minority was concerned. The gates to the empire and imperial service in the colonies and the British military had not been slammed shut. Even as the Gazette in January 1922 urged Protestants to realise, quote, no less than by the majority that they are an integral part of the estate, the treaty debates revealed a darker side to the Loyalists' optimism about the majority's intentions. Lorcan and Robbins may have said that, quote, we want the Southern Unionists and we want every Irishman, hear, hear. But Constance Markievicz excoriated them as, quote, traitors and oppressors. And Art O'Connor said that these people have stood in our way every time we tried to make a little advance. There was, though, still the reliance on Arthur Griffith's good intentions. The Irish Times attached, quote, little importance to the wild abuse of Southern Loyalists, which came from one or two excited speakers in the Dáil. Nevertheless, an abrupt and brutal change could not be ignored, and much angst concentrated on the fate of the ancien regime's institutions in the new state. The Irish Times anxiously inquired about the fate of those offices most closely connected with Britishness in Ireland, the representative peers, the Irish Privy Council, position of Governor-General, the honorary offices of Hereditary Chief Butler, Lord High Steward, the Order of St. Patrick, and so on. The answers coming back from the Registrar of the Office of Arms were not wholly reassuring. A rude reality intruded a few days after the treaty's ratification by the Dáil. The departure of British forces and the handover of Dublin Castle to the new government were tangible reminders that the old order was in the process of vanishing before the minority's eyes. No Irish loyalists can watch the departure of the British garrison without it tugging at the heartstrings, sadly opined the Irish Times on the 14th of January. The great fact, it wrote, is that the 16th of January 1922 will be written in history as the day on which the old regime ceased to exist and the Irish Free State took possession of Dublin Castle. The triumphalist tone of the official report by the Irish side, quote, the members of Rialtas Shaladach na hÉireann received the surrender of Dublin Castle at 1:45 p.m. today. It is now in the hands of the Irish nation, unquote, must have made many Southern Loyalists wonder if they were yet considered, in any real sense, part of that Irish nation. Contrarian Protestant essayist Hubert Butler once summed up the minority as, quote, nobody's children. Butler's description could equally apply to the two Southern Protestants that were most intimately involved in the treaty negotiations and its aftermath. In political proclivity, neither can be said to be in any sense representative of either their class or religious background, and it doesn't appear that their Protestantism brought much to the treaty per se anyway. Robert Childers Barton, who's a member of the Sinn Féin treaty delegation, and his cousin Erskine Childers, who acted as secretary to the treaty conference, are in many respects enigmas. Barton agonised over whether to sign the treaty. His eventual signature was pivotal, but after faithfully voting for it in the Dáil in January 1922, he then rejected it. Childers was an unsettling presence in London, apparently distrusted by all sides. Using family ties, he tried to persuade Barton not to sign. After ratification, he attempted to keep his propaganda operations going, but he was never in the inner circle. As his Dictionary of Irish Biography entry implies, his switch from English Edwardian respectability to hardline Irish republicanism was partly due to his psyche and, quote, the tensions inherent in his Anglo-Irish identity. In one sense, these cousins were throwbacks, a last gasp of that Protestant quasi-aristocratic nationalism which was in the leadership of every rebel and separatist movement since at least the late 17th century. But 1916 had changed all that utterly. Protestants in the advanced nationalist camp were always prone to being outsiders there as well. As George Boyce has put it, quote, Irish society was too divided on sectarian lines to enable any Protestant, however talented or committed, to enter into the experience of the other side. In a perverse symmetry with the likes of Bernard and Saunderson, perhaps deep down, Barton and Childers had no country either. The treaty settlement subsided like a tar with a slow puncture during the decades following its negotiation. In a gradualness of inevitability, to rephrase Sidney Webb, appeals to the Privy Council, the oath of faithfulness to the King, Irish citizenship as a subset of a British one, the Crown's place in the polity, and so on, were watered down or abolished. The new constitution in 1937 derived its legitimacy from a popular vote, not an act of the UK Parliament. That, and the Declaration of the Republic in 1948, cut away the imperial and royalist connectivity that had sustained a comforting identity for the southern minority after independence. Yet the Gazette's practical men of 1922 could take comfort that even as the symbols vanished, the substance of their vital economic, cultural, and social interests remained more or less intact. The treaty was often said to provide nationalists with the freedom to be free, but it actually carried the same potential for the minority, if and when it wanted to. For that minority, perhaps the treaty provided a pathway towards an acceptance of existential change, allowing it eventually to find a country too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that great presentation, very thoughtful. I think now we can pass to some questions from the earlier session, and that was for Dr. Robert Lynch on the Northern Ireland and the Ulster aspects of the treaty. Tom Ahern talks about, he's asking, he says that it appears that permanent partition was opposed by all segments of the nationalist community. Can Robert explain how the British government dealt with this majority opposition to partition in terms of democratic principles? Whether the British leadership believed the Irish had the capacity for self-government. And in a kind of a related question, Jack mentions that Micheál Martin's book on this period is called Freedom to Choose, and he sees that as a misnomer, as that is, quote, exactly what was not allowed by the Articles of Agreement. Mm-hmm. The attempt to choose any other way by De Valera and Collins in 1922 was denied under its terms, and the British insisted on war to make the point leading to what is called the Civil War. Is that not the basic fact of the situation? So if Robert, if you could take those two.
Obviously the democratic deficit and so on is worth mentioning. The way they actually cope with this, interesting enough, is what you get is this strange change with the British government. It's very interesting. What they basically do is play the kind of ethno-national card. You have this fascinating change where Asquith can stand up in 1912 as Prime Minister, and Asquith actually will stand up, and when people suggest maybe a partition is possible, stands up and says, absolutely not, it's a ridiculous idea. The whole suggestion of it's crazy. Ireland, it says, is one nation. It has a unity of culture, temperament, geography, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Now, what you get with Lloyd George, of course, a few years later, he makes almost exactly the same speech. He's asked almost exactly the same question when he's presenting the Government of Ireland Act. And he says exactly the opposite. He basically says that Ireland is two nations. Ireland is two tribes. I think he says nowhere on earth is there such an innate division than you get actually in Ireland. So what you can see the British are basically trying to do now is really frame partition within the broader, I suppose, zeitgeist of Wilsonian democracy. So this idea that borders enclosing distinct ethno-national groups are the way to avert conflict in future, and are in that sense natural. It's a natural thing to do. And we've got to remember, drawing lines on maps in post-war Europe is really sort of state of the art. It's what everyone thinks is going to work. Of course, it never does, at least a huge amounts of conflict. But the British are really trying to square that circle in the interwar period. What they're trying to do, of course, is maintain their own imperial interests, while at the same time, as I say, trying to fit in with this spirit of the times, at least pay lip service to this idea of Wilsonian democracy. They're very worried about, of course, upsetting the Americans. But they can, of course, turn around to the Americans as they do. And, if they can keep a straight face, they can say, well, all Irish people now have self-government. I know it doesn't look exactly the way we thought it might have looked, but they do have their own access to democracy. So I think in that sense, we talk about democracy and democratic ideas. That, you know, I think time and place is very, very important in terms of that. Sorry, yes, Julia. Yeah, Julia.
And in answer to his question, did the British regard the Irish as being capable for self-government, having the capacity for self-government?
I think they do, but I think they do think the Irish has the capacity of self-government, but I think they do feel that the Irish need to be kept on something of a leash. There is this, remember, in the interwar period, we're in a period now, I'm beginning in 1914, almost all of the world now has fallen prey now to colonial empires. There's not much, you know, land left in the world, and Britain's very wary of letting go of its control of the areas that it has. You know, if you look at something like, you know, even unproductive areas or areas that seem very unproductive and troublesome, ended up to be incredibly worthwhile. You look at South Africa. You know, when technology changes and you suddenly get the discovery of diamonds and gold, you realize that, you know, what was really a sort of a colony in South Africa, which was of no great use, suddenly becomes useful. So they're very wary of as I say, letting go of the leash. But I do think they, on their terms, I think it's absolutely true that they believe Irish democracy can work. Yes.
There's another question here for your section from Des Dalton. While reference is often made to violence on both sides, is the reality that the Loyalist violence visited on the Catholic nationalist minority was a pogrom backed by the nascent northern state to force out a sizable section of the minority population from their new state?
I'd say no. I don't think it is actually an organized pogrom. It's reactive reprisal violence that you get. I mean, the violence itself is you can actually time the violence to coincide with incidences of IRA aggression or IRA attacks along the border. You can almost see, if you drew a graph, you could see the minute the news of these attacks on the border or whatever reached the Belfast press, there's a huge kind of explosion. It certainly isn't, I don't think, any sense of kind of ethnic cleansing or anything. I don't think there's any kind of those kind of phrases I don't think work when it comes to Northern Ireland. But I think, as I say, what you've got with violence, and a number of Northern nationalists, you know, plead with Southerners to say you do not understand how dangerous it is. Actually, you know, carrying out attacks in Northern Ireland just leads to, we are this beleaguered minority now, and we're the ones who bear the brunt of these reprisals. We see this again and again and again. When Southern nationalists get involved in the North, they have a very crude understanding of this pattern of reprisal rioting. So certainly, I don't think the word pogrom is appropriate at all now.
Okay, and Des goes on to say that the response from the IRA was nowhere near the same scale, with exceptions, as a matter of policy not directed at the Protestant Unionist population, but against state forces such as the police and the British Army. Would you agree with that, Robert?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you get into a numbers game here in terms of, certainly what happens with the IRA is they become, as 1922 goes on, worryingly, they do become increasingly sectarian. So we see, for example, you know, of course, the Altnavay massacre, which happens down, of course, in South Armagh, which is a clearly sectarian attack. We've got other attacks on the border like that. We have the IRA in 1922 throwing bombs onto trams filled with Protestant shipyard workers. That happened in 1920 as well. The IRA, though, do try and remain aloof from the violence. They do have a rather rarefied view of their role in this. Their role is certainly not, the IRA, to protect the Catholic minority. That's a rather myth that's been put around by the IRA. You know, they see, I mean, what one of them calls the old stone throwing competition. They're not interested. They have higher goals, as it were, in terms of this. And if you look at the IRA, you look at the IRA's casualties. The IRA are not, when the ones who do die are not dying, as it were, on the barricades defending Catholic enclaves in Belfast. That job seems to have gone down, although there's no real research, great deal of research on this, to Ancient Order of Hibernian members and so on, and people arming themselves. So I think the IRA's role is kind of odd in the sense that what they end up doing is almost following the conflict rather than actually leading the direction of the conflict itself. Yeah.
Thanks, Robert. I think I'll go on to a few now for Ian Dalton. Niamh Dillon saying excellent papers to both of you, and many thanks. And Ian, she's asking, why did Southern Irish Protestants allow Lord George to play them like a violin? Why did they not press for more advantage?
That's an interesting question. The best analysis of the Southern Unionist position is still Patrick Buckland's 1972 book, which is a discourse on the highest of high politics. But he goes into it in very great detail. But in essence, he comes up with the conclusion that they were simply not competent. He points out several instances where they may have been able to make an intervention which might have resulted in something concrete, but they failed to do so. And I think the other very important thing, though, is that the Southern Unionists were themselves fatally, they were divided, and I think that is the most critical thing. You had the accommodators led by Lord Middleton and people like Lord Middleton and Andrew Jemison, but you had against them a considerable number of diehards in the old rump of the Irish Unionist Alliance, and it was the sort of southern equivalent of the Northern Not an Inch Brigade, if you like. Wholly unrealistic, of course, but nevertheless making a great deal of noise, and more importantly, having quite a significant number of supporters, not just in the House of Lords, where you might have expected to find them, but actually also amongst the remnants of some Southern Unionists who actually sat for British constituencies in the House of Commons. So that division meant that that played actually into the British government's hands, because one side effectively neutralised the other. And Lloyd George could therefore, in that sense, dismiss the Southern Unionists simply because he was able to play one side off against the other. And at that stage, anyway, I think the overarching thing is that they were already, in essence, out, as I said, out of the picture. They were no longer of any significance. You could almost, adapt that phrase of Stalin's about the Pope. How many divisions does the Pope have? Well, the same thing could be said for the Southern Irish Unionists. They no longer had clout or control. So they could be safely ignored, I suppose, in that sense. So you can't big them up to in the sense of negotiations. They were bit players. They had, because many of them had social cachet, it meant that they had access on a social level to many of the British government ministers on that side of the treaty negotiations. But apart from that, they really did not carry any particular clout at the end of the day. They were already effectively written out of the picture.
Thank you. And there's one from Barry Keane for you. As it turned out, the Irish state was not much of a threat to anyone's livelihood through religion, while regularly being a source of much annoyance. I think that's more a comment than a question.
Well, I would just say there that Barry may well be right, but I'm reminded of a comment which was written in the Bell, I think in the 1940s by Sean O'Faolain, in discussing the fact that the Southern Irish Protestants had been broadly left to manage themselves in their own devices. And he says, incidentally, a fate which Southern Catholics tremendously envied. So I'm not so sure that you can say that Southern Catholics were left to their own devices by their own government. But certainly Southern Protestants tended to have been, shall we say, the management of their own communities was effectively outsourced to themselves after 1922. They had to obey certain overarching state rules, and the classic one would be having to teach the Irish language in schools and so forth. But by and large, they were left to their own devices. And that is why nothing much changed. And that is in tremendous contrast to what happens to the northern minority, of course, the northern minority of Catholics, where the tensions with the state in many senses, were deep-seated and much, much more long-lasting.
Yes, and Inges Mitchell asks, how do you situate the National Land Bank, managed by Barton, Children, Smith, Gordon, all Protestants, or the Irish White Cross set up by the Quaker James Douglas, supported by many Protestants and clearly intended to be politically and culturally ecumenical?
I think that those things that Angus is mentioning are an illustration of the fact that Southern Protestantism, stroke loyalism, stroke ex-unionism, is actually a much broader church than we would like to believe. And I think that the narrowness, some speakers in the previous roundtable session were mentioning the idea that, you know, we should not be overly drawing lines and tribal lines and compartmental lines around this. You know, to some extent, I dismiss Barton and Childers in the context of my own talk as not being representative of their own peoplehood, if you like, and that is broadly true. There's no question about that. But they do represent, I think, what we have are what I would call fuzzy edges. In everything. I mean, there's still closet Catholic Unionists in the leafier part of the Dublin professional classes. These are people who are not going to rock the boat. Quite happy to belong to institutions like professional bodies and yacht clubs with the royal appellation in their names. These are the fuzzy edges of the Irish story, and I think we need to recognise the fact that there are fuzzy edges, and take those into account, and that to some extent leavens the tensions and the stresses that we have had in this country, precisely because it is not black, it is not white. We're not Serbo, we're not Croat, we're not Bosnians, we're not Herzegovinians, that sort of thing.
Very true. And just we might just have a slight bit of time, Robert, for you to answer Pat McCarthy. Did the Irish Treaty delegates err tactically in not building a provision for local plebiscites into the Boundary Commission clause? After all, local plebiscites supervised by the League of Nations were used in Silesia and East Prussia.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. I agree totally with Pat. That is the big problem. They absolutely, if they had insisted, and this is what I mean, if you're trying to, they needed to sit down with this Boundary Commission and work out exactly when it was going to sit. So say 6 months from now, whatever the timeline was, not as it is 2 years. They need to work out exactly what areas were going to be transferred. So you have this commune system with the Versailles Treaty, where people vote in these kind of sort of groups, big groups together, like constituencies. That's one kind of idea. And you also need to know exactly how are they going to ascertain absolutely the wishes of the inhabitants. I think they are absolutely outmaneuvered. I suppose the bigger question is to ask, if they would have put their foot down and insisted, now we want a 50-page document with every single detail of this and when this is going to happen, would Lloyd George himself have actually signed it, or would he have suddenly drawn back? Because that's exactly the kind of imprecision that someone like Lloyd George thrives on in these negotiations.
I think we're going to have to close there. I was going to ask you, Robert, about the level of understanding on behalf of Southern Irish and particularly Southern Republicans towards people in Ulster from all sides. But I think that's like a bigger question. I think you've answered it in your books anyway. But I'm going to thank you both very much for those excellent presentations, and all of you who've contributed questions leading to further debate and discussion on these. You know, there's so much that can be said on all of these, but thank you very much for your research and for the light you've shed on that.